They stood in their Sunday best, holding hands, their eyes dry and faces hard, like they were at a business meeting, not their grandson's funeral. But the truth is, my parents weren't even there. Not in the pews. Not at the wake. Not even a text to say, "I'm sorry." My boy, Noah, was only 6 years old when he died. He loved dinosaurs, blue raspberry slushies, and drawing silly stick figures with big heads. He called my dad Grandpa Joe and made him a crayon drawing every time he came to visit. But when the worst thing that could ever happen to a parent happened to me, they were nowhere. They didn't show up. They didn't care. I found out they went to a golf tournament that weekend. A damn golf tournament. So I made sure they paid the price. Not in a way that would get me locked up.
No.
I wanted something worse. I wanted them to feel it, to live it, to know what it's like to lose something that matters, slowly, painfully. I wanted them to regret every choice that led to that moment. And they did. It didn't happen all at once. I waited.
Planned.
Smiled when they visited, hugged them tight like nothing happened. But every step I took was a step toward making sure they'd never forget what they did.
Or didn't do.
But to understand how I got there, you have to know where it all started.
You have to know about me. About Noah. About them.
Before the grief. Before the revenge. Back when life was still full of light. We lived in a quiet suburb outside of Chicago. It had old trees that bloomed pink in the spring, and those little free library boxes on corners that always had too many cookbooks. My husband, David, was a high school English teacher, and I worked from home doing bookkeeping for a few small businesses. Life was simple, predictable,
happy.
Noah was our only child. After 3 miscarriages, I'd stopped believing we'd ever have a baby. But then, one sunny April morning, he arrived, tiny and wrinkly and furious at the cold air. From the moment he opened those wide, blue eyes, he became the sun in our little universe. He was the kind of kid that made people smile in grocery stores. He had curly hair that never laid flat, cheeks like little apples, and a giggle that could melt the ice off your worst day. He gave compliments like he breathed, naturally and often. "You're a great walker," he once told a stranger on the sidewalk. My parents, Joe and Linda, were hands-off grandparents, the kind that liked to post photos for Facebook likes but didn't want to do bedtime duty. Still, Noah adored them. Every time they came over, which wasn't often, he'd run up with his scribbled art and jump into their arms. They would pat his head, chuckle, and say things like, "You're growing like a weed." They never really stayed long. "We have early tea time tomorrow," Dad would say, or, "Your mom's bridge group is meeting tonight." David would just roll his eyes. I'd smile through the disappointment, telling myself that some love is better than none. I believed that lie for too long. The year everything changed was 2023. It started like any other year: school drop-offs, work meetings, spilled cereal bowls. Then one night in February, Noah got a fever. Nothing big, just 101.2. We gave him some Tylenol, kept him home from kindergarten, and let him watch dinosaur cartoons under a blanket on the couch. By morning, he was worse. By afternoon, he was pale, barely responsive. We rushed him to the ER. The doctors swarmed around him, their voices sharp and clipped. I kept thinking, this can't be happening. He was just a little sick. Just a cold.
He was supposed to be fine.
But he wasn't. The infection spread fast. Blood poisoning.
Sepsis.
The doctors said words like, rare and unusual response. He went from the ER to the ICU in hours. Tubes and machines surrounded his tiny body. His little hand looked so small, wrapped in wires. I didn't sleep. I didn't eat. I just held his hand and whispered, "I'm here, baby. Mommy's here." David never left the hospital either. We sat beside each other, reading to him, singing, begging the universe to give us more time. My parents didn't come to the hospital. Not once. They sent one text. "Keep us updated. Let us know if you need anything." That was it. I called them, sobbing. Told them we didn't know if he'd make it. My dad said, "Hospitals aren't our thing. You understand."
No.
I didn't. 5 days later, my son died in my arms. I remember the moment like it's carved into my bones. His chest rose. then fell, and didn't rise again. I screamed. David collapsed beside me. Nurses came in. Machines were turned off. Everything after that was a blur. I couldn't sleep. I couldn't breathe. I didn't know how to live in a world where Noah didn't exist. But even in that fog of grief, I waited for them. My parents. I waited for them to call, to knock on our door, to hold me like I was their baby again. They didn't. They didn't come to the wake. They didn't come to the funeral. They didn't even send flowers. I called them 2 days after the funeral. My mom answered. "Oh, honey," she said, like I'd scraped my knee. "We didn't want to intrude. We thought maybe it would be too hard for you to see us." Too hard to see them? I hung up. David was furious. He wanted to drive to their house and scream at them. But I stopped him. "I want them to feel this," I said, my voice hollow. "And I know just how to make that happen." I didn't strike right away. That's not how real revenge works. Not the kind that sticks. Not the kind that makes people truly understand what they've done.
No.
I had to make them see what they were. I had to make them live it. So I started visiting them again. Fake smile. Hugs. "I'm doing okay," I'd say. Taking it one day at a time. They believed it. They thought time would heal all wounds. They thought ignoring the worst day of my life would just fade away. But I was watching. Planning. I found their weakness. And I waited until it was exactly the right time to pull the thread. One afternoon, about 6 months after Noah passed, my dad invited me to dinner. "We're grilling steaks," he said. "You and David should come." It was the first invitation we'd gotten since the funeral. We went. I sat at their polished table, across from their neatly trimmed hedges, listening to them complain about traffic and gas prices. I stared at the framed photos on the walls. None of them were of Noah. Not one. I asked casually, "Do you ever think about him?" My mom sipped her wine. "Of course we do, sweetie. All the time." Then she looked down at her plate, cutting her steak into perfect squares. Like it was just something to say. Something polite. That was the moment I knew. They hadn't just missed the funeral. They had buried him long before that. Buried the love, the responsibility, the truth. And that's when the idea came to me. Not a spark. A storm. I looked at David. He gave me the smallest nod. It was time. It began that very night. My dad had gone inside to get dessert. My mom stayed on the patio with me. And I told her something that changed everything. "I saw the will," I said. She blinked. "What will?" "Noah's. The one you and Dad signed when we asked you to be his legal guardians if anything happened to us." Her face froze. I leaned in. "You remember that, don't you? The document that made you next of kin? Beneficiaries?" Her hand trembled on her glass. I smiled. "Well, guess what? That document makes you legally tied to the choices we made for him, including the trust fund, the medical decisions, the house." She opened her mouth, but nothing came out. And I said, "It's going to get complicated for you. Really complicated." And that's when the door burst open. David stood there, his face white. "You need to come inside. Now." I rushed in. My dad was on the floor, clutching his chest, gasping. And I stood there, frozen, watching the man who couldn't be bothered to show up for his grandson's funeral clutch his heart like it was finally breaking. And then, the sound that came from my father wasn't human. It was wet, broken, a gurgle tangled in a gasp. His fingers clutched at the air like he could grab onto life and force it to stay. My mom dropped her wine glass. It shattered against the tile. She screamed, but I didn't move. I just stood there, staring at him. This man, who couldn't be bothered to attend the funeral of the child who loved him like a hero, was now lying in a pool of his own sweat, shaking like a leaf in a storm. David knelt beside him, already calling 911, pressing his hand to my dad's chest.
"Joe.
Stay with me. Breathe, man." I didn't speak. I didn't cry. I didn't even blink. I just watched. Watched as the universe cracked open for him. The ambulance came fast. Red lights bounced off the walls like fireflies on speed. Paramedics stormed in, barking commands, lifting his body onto a gurney with machine precision. My mom followed them to the hospital, hysterical, her words a jumble of "I don't understand," and "he was fine this morning." David drove us there in silence. When we got to the ER, the nurse brought my mom into a side room. I stayed in the waiting room, cold and quiet, staring at the flickering light above the vending machines. He survived.
Barely.
It was a heart attack, and the doctor said it was a miracle he made it. He'd need surgery, time off,
Rehab.
he'd be vulnerable.
Weak.
It should have filled me with guilt. It didn't. It only made what came next even more perfect. Because now he'd need help. And I was going to be the one to give it to him. After he was released, my mom begged me to help out. "Please," she said, eyes swollen from crying. "Just for a little while. I don't know what I'd do without you." I told her I'd think about it. The next day, I showed up at their front door with a meal tray, a gentle smile, and the same fake warmth they had used with Noah so many times. "Of course I'll help," I told them. "We're family." It was the first move. I started visiting every day, bringing him his medication, preparing food, driving him to follow-up appointments. I organized his pill box, helped him shower, even trimmed his toenails. I was the perfect daughter. But each act of kindness was a brick in the wall I was building around them. Because while I was smiling on the outside, inside, I was unspooling everything they'd built, piece by piece. The next thread I pulled was the country club. My parents were longtime members of a prestigious golf club, the kind of place where people wore sweaters tied around their shoulders and called you "darling" while judging your car. My dad practically lived there. He was on the board. It was his kingdom. And he had a secret. A messy one. See, a few years earlier, I'd helped him with some creative accounting. He was skimming, nothing big, just some membership fees, equipment deals, petty reimbursements. I didn't approve, but back then, I didn't say anything. I kept the spreadsheets. Saved the emails. I thought I was protecting my family. Now, those files were a weapon. I leaked them anonymously to the club treasurer. He was removed from the board within a week. Investigation pending. His name, the one he spent decades building, was suddenly dirt. He thought it was bad luck. He thought it was coincidence. I just made him more tea. Then came the house. My parents had a beautiful colonial-style home. Paid off. Pristine. But it had a little flaw, an unregistered second kitchen in the basement. One they rented out unofficially for years to make extra cash. I tipped off the city. Zoning violations. Safety infractions. Fines stacked like pancakes. My mom sobbed when she opened the letter. "I don't understand why this is happening," she said. "I'm so sorry," I told her, rubbing her back. I wasn't sorry. I was just getting started. David didn't know the full extent of what I was doing. He saw some of it. Suspected more.
But he didn't ask.
He was grieving too, in his own quiet way. We still barely spoke about Noah. His name was a ghost in the house, floating through rooms, rattling doorknobs, opening wounds with the sound of his laughter on old videos. We kept the door to his room shut. But sometimes at night I'd sneak in, sit on his bed, hold his favorite stuffed dinosaur, and cry until I couldn't breathe. That grief? It fueled everything. It had been about 3 months since my father's heart attack when the next piece of my plan unfolded. I brought over groceries one morning and found my mom sitting on the floor, surrounded by papers. "What's going on?" I asked. She looked up at me with red eyes. "It's your father's pension. There's an issue with the insurance company. Something about a missed form, a changed beneficiary. I don't know. We might not get anything this month." I knelt beside her and started organizing the papers. But I already knew the problem, because I had made it the problem. 2 years earlier, when they named me as their emergency contact and gave me limited access to their financial profiles, just in case something happened, I made a few minor tweaks. Nothing illegal. Just enough to delay things. To confuse the systems. To make sure their safety net had holes. They always told me, "You never learn unless you struggle." I was just teaching them. But what I didn't expect was the call I got the next day. It was from Karen. Karen was my mother's oldest friend, since high school. She was blunt, sharp-witted, and didn't trust anyone who used powdered creamer. She called me out of the blue and said, "What the hell is going on with your mom?" I blinked. "What do you mean?" "She called me last night crying about some curse or bad karma or something. Said things keep falling apart. That someone's punishing them." My stomach went cold. Did she say why she thought that? Karen paused. She said it's because of Noah. Silence. She said she thinks God is punishing them for not going to the funeral. And there it was. The first crack in their armor. The first glimmer of understanding. I wasn't religious. I didn't believe in divine vengeance. But they did. And now, that belief was turning on them. I could have stopped there. Maybe I should have. But pain has a way of digging in deep, of making you crave more than justice. You crave balance. And I wasn't done tipping the scales. So, I reached out to someone I hadn't spoken to in years. My brother. Ryan. Estranged. Recovering addict. Lived across the country. He'd cut ties with our parents after they refused to help him get clean, told him to figure it out and locked the door behind him. I found him through a friend.
Called him.
Told him what happened with Noah. He cried on the phone. And then I told him everything they'd done. Or failed to do.
And Ryan? He wanted in. He flew out that week.
I met him at the airport. He looked older, thinner, but there was light in his eyes again. He hugged me tight. "Let's bury the past," he said, "and dig up the truth." We planned everything, down to the last detail. And when Ryan showed up on their doorstep, when my mom opened that door and saw the son she hadn't spoken to in 7 years standing there, she screamed. Then she fainted. And that's where the real chaos began. My mom crumpled like a puppet with its strings cut. Ryan caught her before she hit the floor, but not before her head smacked the doorframe with a soft thunk. I rushed up behind him, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the pure weight of the moment. She hadn't seen him in almost a decade. 7 years of silence, 7 years of pretending he didn't exist. And now, here he was, standing in their doorway with a suitcase in one hand and a half-smile on his face. "I'm back, Ma," he said softly. "You gonna invite me in?" When she came to, dazed and blinking, her eyes flicked between Ryan and me. "Well, what is this?" she whispered, her voice cracking. "It's family," I said. "The kind that shows up. To understand why my parents hadn't spoken to Ryan in years, you have to understand them. Joe and Linda, their world was built on image. Appearances. They wore their reputation like armor, and they didn't like things or people that scratched the surface. Ryan was messy. He struggled with pills after a car accident in college. It started with pain meds, then spiraled into harder things. He tried to get help. He begged. But my parents didn't believe in therapy. Or rehab. Or second chances. "You made your bed," Dad had said back then. "Now lie in it." So Ryan did. On park benches. In halfway houses. And eventually, on a cold bus ride to nowhere. I tried to stay in touch, but I had Noah. A family. A life I was barely keeping upright. When he called me that one final time in 2018, slurring and sobbing, I told him I couldn't send money again. "I'm not giving up on you," I said. "But I can't save you." Then I didn't hear from him for 3 years. Until now. My dad, still recovering from his heart attack, came hobbling out of the bedroom a few minutes later, his face pale when he saw Ryan sitting at the kitchen table. He stopped cold. "What the hell is this?" Ryan raised a hand like it was a casual reunion. "Hey, Pops. Long time no forgiveness." My dad's jaw clenched so tight, I thought his teeth would crack. "Get out." "No," I said. "He's staying. This is my house." "No," I said again, stepping between them. "It's our house. Remember that guardianship paperwork? The trust? You and Mom signed it. That legally makes me a part owner now. Technically, it's 3-way. I paused. Me, you, and Noah. Their faces went blank. They'd forgotten. Or maybe they thought I would. But I hadn't. I never forgot. Ryan stayed in the guest room. It drove my parents insane. He ate their food. watched their TV, walked around barefoot. My mom kept leaving pamphlets for Christian renewal retreats on his bed. My dad refused to speak to him, acting like he was some ghost floating through their house. But what they didn't realize was that Ryan was the final key to their unraveling. Because Ryan knew secrets. Things I hadn't even known. Like how my dad had a second, unreported retirement account. Or how my mom had hidden jewelry, valuable stuff in a storage unit under a different name. They'd lied to everyone, including each other. And Ryan? He started pulling those threads. Meanwhile, I kept playing the part of dutiful daughter.
Cooking. Cleaning.
Smiling. I scheduled a physical therapist to come for my dad twice a week. I managed their appointments. I even updated their insurance paperwork after making a few adjustments to their listed emergency contacts and authorized access. All legal. All subtle. They were still too proud to ask how I was affording it all. I let them wonder. Truth was, I was using their money. The money they left behind in Noah's trust fund when they skipped his funeral. Funds that, thanks to their signatures, could now be partially redirected for family care and legacy realignment. I had a lawyer. A quiet one. And every dollar I used was another reminder that this wasn't revenge anymore. It was reformation. I wasn't destroying them. I was forcing them to live in the rubble they built. Then came the gala. Every year, my parents hosted a neighborhood fundraiser at the local community center. Wine, canapes, silent auctions. It was their pride and joy, the one night they could pretend to be pillars of the community. This year, I offered to help. They were thrilled. I handled the invitations, the mailing list, the catering, and behind the scenes, Ryan and I sent out a few extra invites. We reached out to people they didn't expect to see again. Like the woman my dad dated behind my mom's back in 2004. Or the man my mom borrowed money from temporarily and never paid back. Or the former housekeeper who overheard everything. It was the most unforgettable night of their lives. Everyone came. Everyone talked. Everyone knew. By the time the dessert was served, my parents were standing in a corner, sweating through their clothes, while whispers followed them like shadows. The final blow came when Ryan stood up and made a toast. To family, he said, raising his glass. The ones who show up, and the ones who don't. He didn't say Noah's name. He didn't have to. The silence afterward said it all. We left early. I took one last look at my parents, frozen, humiliated, broken in a way no heart attack could ever achieve. But still, I felt that twinge inside. That voice. Is this really justice? Or just cruelty in a prettier dress? I didn't answer it. Not yet. Because I wasn't done. Not until they stood where I stood. Not until they understood. A week later, I got a call from my mom. Her voice was thin, fragile. I need to talk to you. I met her at the old park near our childhood home. She was sitting on a bench, hands shaking, holding a folded piece of paper. I found this in your father's drawer, she said. I didn't know. I swear I didn't know. I took the paper from her hands, and what I saw made my blood run cold. It was a letter addressed to me, dated 2 days before Noah's funeral, in my dad's handwriting, and it read, "We can't come.
I'm sorry.
I know it's wrong. I know it's unforgivable. But I can't see him in that box. I can't say goodbye. I loved him more than I ever told you. I just can't watch him disappear. Please don't hate me." I read it twice. 3 times. Then I looked up. I didn't know he wrote it, she said. He never sent it. He kept it buried. Like everything else. For the first time, I saw tears in her eyes that didn't look performative. They looked real. Like regret had finally cracked her open. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered. "We failed you. We failed him." For a second, everything in me went still. All the anger. The weight. The fire. It hovered there. Then, my phone rang. I looked at the screen. It was the lawyer. I almost didn't answer. But I did. "Hey," he said. "We got a problem. One of the fund transfers you initiated, it triggered a review. Someone flagged it. The trust is being audited." My stomach dropped. "And your parents?" he said. They're going to be asked some very uncomfortable questions. And that's when the real storm hit. The thing about revenge is it has a half-life. At first, it glows hot, satisfying, intoxicating. But the longer it burns, the more it poisons everything around it. Even the people you thought deserved it. Especially yourself. When the audit started, everything spiraled faster than I expected. It began with a letter from the Family Trust Oversight Board. Dry legalese, but the meaning was clear. The trust created in Noah's name was under full review. They were looking into disbursements, ownership transfers, and caregiver stipends, especially the ones linked to my parents' accounts. I had dotted every I, crossed every T, but one thing I hadn't accounted for was volume. I'd moved too much, too fast. A red flag triggered, and now the spotlight was on them.
Not me. Them.
I told David everything. Sat him down at the kitchen table. Noah's art still taped to the fridge like he was just away at school, and I unloaded it all. The fake smiles. The leaks. The gala sabotage. The financial chokehold. Ryan. At first, he didn't say a word. Just stared at me like I was someone he didn't recognize. When I was done, he rubbed his eyes and whispered, "What are we doing, Jenna?" I almost broke. I wanted them to feel it, I said. The loss. The weight. They walked away from their grandson's funeral like it was a boring dinner party. I couldn't let that go. "And now what?" he asked. "They lose everything? End up in court? You want to see them homeless?" "I want them to understand," I snapped. "No, you want to hurt them."
Silence.
His words hit like a slap because they were true. And yet, part of me still felt like it wasn't enough. Like I hadn't even scratched the surface of what they owed Noah. But the audit didn't care about my pain. It was brutal. Investigators reached out to my parents, asking for account statements, receipts, anything that could justify the caregiver funds they'd unknowingly benefited from. They were confused at first, then furious. My dad left me a voicemail. Just 5 words. "You did this to us." I didn't call back. My mom tried a different tactic. She came over in person, looking thinner than I'd ever seen her. Eyes sunken, lips dry. She looked like a balloon that had been slowly leaking air. "You have to fix this," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "Fix what?" "They're talking about freezing our accounts, Jenna. Our pensions. Our assets. The house." "I thought the house was yours," I said, voice cold. "That's what you told Ryan." Her face crumbled. She slumped onto the couch, defeated. "I don't care about the money," she whispered. "But I do care about losing my family. All of it. I've already lost too much." I wanted to scream. "You lost too much?" I wanted to drag her to Noah's empty room, throw open the door, and show her what loss really looked like. But I didn't. Because in that moment, something shifted. She wasn't defending herself anymore. She was unraveling. The next day, I met with the lawyer. Told him to slow everything down. Halt all distributions. Voluntarily submit our records. Cooperate fully. "You sure?" he asked, eyebrows raised. "They won't walk away clean, Jenna. But you still have leverage." I was tired of leverage. I was tired of playing God with people's lives. Even when they had played judge and jury with mine. Ryan wasn't happy. "This was the plan," he said. "We were almost there." But he didn't understand. Because that letter, the one my dad wrote and never sent, was still burning a hole in my purse. I pulled it out and handed it to him. He read it, then sat down hard. "You believe it?" he asked. "No," I said. "But I believe it's a start." He stayed a few more days after that. Then one morning, he packed his bag and left. No goodbye speech. No big moment. Just a post-it on the fridge that said, "Don't let your pain turn you into them." But the storm wasn't done. A week later, David and I were having dinner when my phone rang again. Blocked number. I let it go to voicemail. Then I listened. It was a man's voice.
Calm.
Professional. "Hello. This is Investigator Miller with the State Department of Child Welfare Trust Oversight. We need to speak with you regarding recent trust activity and your designation as primary caregiver and fund manager for the late Noah Whitman. Please return this call immediately." I stared at the phone, because something in his tone wasn't just about money. It was about accusation. David looked up from his plate. What's wrong? I didn't answer, because I suddenly realized something. This wasn't just about my parents anymore.
This was about me.
The next day, I met with the investigator. He was polite but direct. We've reviewed several transactions that appear unusual, he said, scrolling through his tablet. And the audit trail shows reallocation of funds to unrelated parties. He tapped the screen. My name was there. So was Ryan's. Even David's account was listed. I didn't take anything for myself, I said, defensive. Every cent went towards something connected to the family or… Intent doesn't always equal legality, he interrupted gently. He wasn't accusing me of theft. Not yet. But this could go places I hadn't imagined. Charges.
Fines. Worse.
I'd spent so much time weaving a web for my parents, I hadn't seen how tangled in it I had become. I left the meeting shaking. David was waiting for me in the car. When I told him everything, he just sat there. Then he asked me one question, one I didn't know how to answer. Jenna, would Noah be proud of what you've done? I turned away, stared out the window, because for the first time in a long time, I wasn't sure. The fallout came fast. My parents were summoned to appear for a financial review hearing. Not criminal, not yet, but public. Their name would be in records. Their reputation would take another blow. I had to decide, step back and let them fall completely or show up, offer a sworn statement, and try to clean some of the wreckage I'd created. That night, I went into Noah's room. I sat on his bed and held the stuffed dinosaur in my chest. And for the first time in months, I whispered his name aloud.
Noah.
It broke something in me. I wept until the sun came up. And by morning, I knew what I had to do. I went to the hearing, stood in front of the board, told the truth. Not just about the money, but about everything. The grief, the betrayal, the revenge. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I didn't try to excuse it. I just laid it bare. My parents sat behind me. My dad had his cane. My mom clutched a tissue. They didn't interrupt. They didn't defend. When I sat back down, my dad looked at me with eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not cold, not arrogant, just old, and tired, and sad. I should have been there, he whispered. I know, I said. The board ruled to freeze all related transfers for 60 days. All assets tied to the trust were to be reviewed independently. No charges were filed for now. It wasn't a win, but it wasn't a loss either. It was a reckoning, and the beginning of something new. But just when I thought the dust had settled, a letter arrived at my door. No return address. Inside was a photo, a grainy black and white shot. My parents, standing outside a building I didn't recognize, holding a newborn baby. And on the back, written in shaky handwriting, "You were never supposed to see this." I stared at the photo, at the woman beside my father. She wasn't my mother. And suddenly, everything I thought I knew about my family shattered. Because this was a secret older than revenge. Older than Noah. And it was about to change everything. I couldn't stop staring at the photo. The grainy black and white image had a ghostly feel to it, like a piece of someone else's history that had somehow drifted into mine. My father, 20, maybe 25 years younger, stood stiffly in a worn suit, clutching a baby wrapped in a blanket. Beside him was a woman I had never seen before. She wasn't my mother, and yet, there was something eerily familiar about her. The shape of her face, the slight tilt of her chin, the way she looked at the baby, not just like a mother, but like someone who had already said goodbye. The back of the photo said, "You were never supposed to see this." I flipped it over again. That baby. It couldn't be Ryan. He was born in the house I grew up in. I remembered the photos. The birthday videos. All of it. But this wasn't him. Which meant there was someone else. Someone I didn't know existed. Someone they'd hidden from us. I shoved the photo into my drawer and locked it. 2 days later, I confronted my mother.
I didn't yell.
I didn't accuse. I simply placed the photo on the table between us like a playing card. Her hand trembled as she picked it up.
She didn't deny it.
Her voice cracked as she spoke. Her name was Mara.
She didn't look at me.
She was your father's first love.
Before me.
Before everything. They had a child together when they were barely out of college. A girl. My breath caught. A girl? I repeated. She nodded. Your father's parents made them give her up. They said she'd ruin his future. That it was a shame. Mara wanted to keep her, but Joe, he didn't fight them. Tears slid down her cheeks. I didn't know about her until after we were married. I found a letter. He never meant to tell me. Never meant to tell anyone. I felt like the floor was gone beneath me. Why didn't you tell us? Because it wasn't my story to tell, she whispered. And he never forgave himself. I stood up, dizzy. Somehow, this secret hurt more than anything else. Even after all they'd done, I never imagined they could bury a whole person. My sister. Out there. Somewhere. Lost. Like Noah. That night, I sat with David in silence. The news settled between us like thick fog. There's more to this than we know, I said. He looked at me, tired but steady. Do you want to find her? I didn't answer right away. Then I said, I think she deserves to know who her family really is. And maybe, just maybe, we deserve to find out who we were too. The search took weeks. Ryan helped. So did a private investigator we hired through David's school connections. They tracked adoption records, old addresses, archived hospital files. And then a hit. Her name was Emily Ross. 40 years old. Lived in St. Paul, Minnesota. Married. No kids. Graphic designer. Quiet life. I stared at her photo online. Professional headshot. Brown hair pulled into a ponytail. Kind eyes behind glasses. She looked so much like Dad. My heart thudded as I clicked through the pages. She didn't know who we were. She didn't even know she'd been given up. We confirmed that through her adoption records, sealed but cracked open just enough to see. Her parents had died years earlier. She was alone. And now she had a sister, a brother, a nephew she never got to meet. I wrote her a letter. Nothing dramatic. Just the truth. Who I was. Who she might be. What had happened. And that we didn't expect anything. But we thought she deserved to know. We mailed it. And waited. 3 weeks passed before anything came back. A letter. Handwritten. Neat, careful script. Dear Jenna, I don't even know where to begin. I've read your letter at least 30 times. I've cried every time. I always felt something was missing. Now I know what. I'm not angry. I'm just overwhelmed. I would like to meet. When the time feels right. Thank you for telling me. Thank you for being brave. With love. Emily. The first time we met was at a small cafe halfway between us. She walked in wearing a soft green sweater and holding a book. She hugged me before I could even say hello. Her voice shook as she said, I thought I was the only one. We sat for hours. Talking. Crying. Sharing stories. I told her about Noah. She cried for him like she had known him her whole life. I believed she had. Somewhere in her bones, she had felt him too. My parents didn't want to meet her at first. Too much guilt. Too much shame. But Emily wasn't angry. She was curious. And gentle. She agreed to meet them if they were willing. One afternoon in a small garden behind a hospice care center where Dad had started volunteering for the first time in his life, they met her. Mom sobbed. Dad just looked at her, speechless. Then he whispered, You have your mother's eyes. And I knew the healing had finally begun. The audit ended without charges. The board found no malicious intent. Funds were redirected to a new family trust, managed by a third party. My parents' accounts were monitored, but untouched. We all got off lighter than we deserved. Especially me. Ryan moved back out west, but we talk every week now. Emily visits once a month. She and David bonded instantly. And one day, she brought a little green dinosaur plush to place on Noah's shelf. No one's ever truly gone, she said. Sometimes, we just have to find them again. One night, months later, I sat alone on the porch. The wind was soft. The stars clear. David joined me, handed me a cup of tea. You okay? He asked. I nodded. I think I'm finally ready to live again. He smiled, then looked out into the night. And in that quiet, I felt something shift inside me. The pain was still there, but it was no longer steering the ship.
Kindness was.
Empathy.
Truth.
My parents still carry their guilt, but they carry it with us now, not in silence. My mom calls every week. My dad, still stiff with emotion, has started volunteering at the Children's Hospital. He's not trying to erase the past. He's trying to honor it. And me? I tell Noah's story wherever I go. Not the part about the revenge, but the part about love, about what it means to show up. Because that's the only legacy that matters. And now, finally, he has a whole family that shows up. Every single time.